Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show engineered to take your most complicated stack of sources, the articles, the history, the dense research, and distill the absolute essential, must-know insights you need, delivered with pace, context, and zero fluff.
Today, we are undertaking a deep exploration of a life that remains one of the most remarkable and, ironically, one of the most meticulously documented lives of the late Middle Ages.
We're talking about Joan of Arc, or Jeanne d'Arc.
Exactly. And that documentation you mentioned, it's really the key.
Her life was just shockingly brief, right? 19 years, around 1412 to 1431.
Yeah, but because she achieved this spectacular military success and then, underwent two massive legal proceedings.
A condemnation trial and then the rehabilitation.
Right. And because of that, we have this treasure trove of direct testimony and legal records. It's so unusual for a peasant woman from that time.
It really is. Which brings us to our mission for you today.
We're not just reciting the legend, we are synthesizing her entire story, focusing on the mechanism of her trajectory, how deep religious conviction drove high-stakes military action, and how that success made her the ultimate political target during the tumultuous 100 Years' War.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with the woman herself. Her name originally was Jeanne d'Arc.
We also see some historical variations like Tark or Dart. She was born into a surprisingly established, propertied peasant family in a village called Domremy. Her father was Jacques d'Arc.
And her identity, the name she actually used, is so important.
It is. She didn't call herself Joan of Arc. She referred to herself most frequently as Jeanne la Pucelle.
Joan the Maiden.
Exactly. And this wasn't just a nickname. It was fundamental to her entire mission. It was about her virginity, which she saw as the leading physical proof of her divine mandate.
And the name we all use today, the Maid of Orléans.
That came much, much later, not until the 16th century, really.
It's also a crucial detail that she came from a background where literacy just wasn't a thing.
Right. She was an illiterate peasant girl. She wasn't taught to read or write in her childhood, so all her famous letters, her communiques, they were all dictated.
The idea that she might have learned to sign her name later is debated, but her wisdom and her political sharpness were completely separate from any kind of formal education.
Absolutely.
To really get a handle on Joan's impact, we have to start with the catastrophe of her era. She was born into a France that was just completely consumed by the 100 Years' War. This conflict had been grinding on since 1337.
Yeah, so for almost a century by the time she was born. And it was all rooted in English territorial status in France. And, more importantly, these English claims to the French throne itself.
So by the time Joan is growing up in the 1410s and 20s, France is just devastated. The economy is ruined.
And the leadership was completely fractured. The political landscape was essentially a civil war layered on top of an international one.
A big part of that was the leadership vacuum. The French king, Charles VI, suffered from these severe recurring bouts of mental illness,
which left him, functionally unable to rule for long stretches. And that created the perfect environment for these two major French factions to just descend into a deadly civil war.
Okay, so let's break those down. Who were the two parties?
On one side, you had the Armagnacs. They were the staunch supporters of the rightful heir, the Dauphin Charles, who would later become Charles VII.
And on the other?
The Burgundians. And they were a huge problem because after their duke was assassinated by Armagnac partisans in 1419, they threw their lot in completely with the English.
So French nobles siding with a foreign invader.
Exactly. And this internal feud led to the 1420 Treaty of Troyes. This treaty, signed by Charles VI's own wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, was just the ultimate act of political self-destruction for the French crown.
Because it completely disinherited the Dauphin, her own son.
It did. It arranged for the succession of the French throne to pass to the English heir, Henry V, who would marry the French princess.
And then, just to add to the chaos.
The chaos really kicks in. In 1422, both Henry V of England and Charles VI of France die, almost at the same time.
Wow.
So the beneficiary of that treaty becomes this 9-month-old infant, Henry VI of England. And he's immediately proclaimed king of an Anglo-French dual monarchy.
Which leaves the Dauphin Charles VII in just a desperate, vulnerable position.
Utterly. His legitimacy was so tenuous. There were all these political and popular rumors that he wasn't even the legitimate son of Charles VI.
Right, the rumors about an affair between Queen Isabeau and the Duke of Orléans.
Exactly. And that doubt was a massive, paralyzing vulnerability for the Armagnac cause. He couldn't command the loyalty needed to expel the English if people questioned his very right to be king.
So let's zoom in on Joan's specific world. Domremy. Her family, well, they were peasant farmers. They were doing okay.
They were. Her father, Jacques, owned about 50 acres of land. He collected local taxes, even headed the town watch. Joan herself was doing, the typical work of a girl of that status. Household chores, spinning wool, helping in the fields.
But Domremy was basically an island. It was loyal to the Armagnacs, but surrounded by hostile, pro-Burgundian territory.
And those raids in 1419 and 1425, they weren't just abstract political threats. They were violent, real events. And this constant threat created this fierce community belief. The only way to get peace was to kick the English out.
This is the fertile ground where her mission really takes root.
It is. Around age 13, so about 1425, Joan had her first vision. She was in the family garden.
And she testified that it was St. Michael.
St. Michael, surrounded by angels, appeared to her. And the intensity of it was profound. She said she wept, just desperately wanting to go with them.
Her voices then became a regular thing, often when the church bells were ringing. And they included St. Michael, the archangel, but also two very specific female saints.
St. Margaret, likely of Antioch, and St. Catherine of Alexandria.
And the choice of those two women is just, it's so symbolic.
It's deeply symbolic. Both were renowned virgin saints who were tortured and martyred for their faith. They defied powerful rulers while maintaining their purity.
They embodied that exact blend of purity and, well, aggressive defiance that Joan would come to represent.
Absolutely. And it was through these voices that she swore a vow of virginity, which, as we said, became central to her identity as La Pucelle.
And this commitment was even tested locally, right? There was a court case.
There was. A young man from her village claimed she'd broken a promise to marry him. She went before an ecclesiastical court and said she'd made no such promise and that her vow to her voices superseded any earthly contract. The court just dismissed the case.
And at the same time, in the bigger picture, there were these prophecies floating around France.
Prophetic currents, yeah. And her story fit them perfectly. A popular prophecy stated that France, which had been destroyed by a woman,
referring to Queen Isabeau in the Treaty of Troy,
would be saved by an armed virgin.
So by 1428, she's ready. She travels to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs and petitions the garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, for an escort to the Dauphin at Chinon.
Her first attempt was a flat-out refusal. He basically laughed her off and sent her home.
But the war was reaching its climax. By July of 1428, the English had laid siege to Orléans.
And this city was strategically vital. It was the last major stronghold, preventing the English from just pouring into the rest of Charles's territory south of the Loire. If Orléans fell, the French cause was, for all intents and purposes, finished.
And the final straw, the thing that finally swayed Baudricourt, was the Battle of the Herrings in early 1429.
Such a demoralizing defeat. An Armagnac relief convoy was just annihilated by the English. It was crushing, and it highlighted just how desperate the situation was.
Baudricourt relented only after that disaster.
He did. He provided the escort. And crucially, before leaving, Joan cut her hair short and put on men's clothes given to her by her escorts and the locals. A choice that was rooted in practicality, spirituality, and necessity, and one she would maintain for the rest of her very short life.
So with her escort, she travels across enemy territory to Chinon. She arrives in early 1429. She's just 17 years old.
And she's there to meet the Dauphin, Charles VII, who's 26.
Her goals were so clear and immediate. First, relieve the brutal siege of Orléans.
And second, lead Charles to Reims, the traditional site of French coronations, for his consecration.
The most famous part of this meeting, though, is what happened in private. As we discussed, Charles was just paralyzed by doubts about his own legitimacy.
Joan's intervention here wasn't tactical, it was psychological, it was political. In that private moment, she somehow convinced him that he was, in fact, the legitimate son of Charles VI.
And that reassurance was exactly what he and his entire court needed to break their inertia. Her belief gave him the certainty that he lacked.
But the court, it was full of skeptical noblemen and cautious theologians. They needed public proof before they committed the kingdom's resources to some peasant girl who claimed she was getting messages from God.
So they put her through the ringer.
Absolutely. She was subjected to 3 rigorous tests of legitimacy.
The first was the theological test of Poitiers.
Right. A council of theologians who were highly skeptical of private revelation. They examined her very, very carefully. And their final report was actually pretty pragmatic. They concluded she was a good person and a good Catholic, and they couldn't find any immediate theological flaw.
But they didn't exactly endorse her.
No, and this is where you see the pragmatic medieval mindset. They decided that the source of her inspiration would be judged by results. The proof wasn't in her words. It was in her actions.
They would test her divine commission by sending her to Orléans.
Exactly. If she succeeded in lifting the siege, that would be the sign they needed.
Okay, so test number 2 was much more personal.
It was the physical verification of her virginity at Tours. Women, directed by Charles's very shrewd mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, performed this inspection.
And this was absolutely vital. It wasn't just about confirming her status as the prophesied virgin savior La Pucelle.
No, it was also a theological safeguard. If she weren't a virgin, she could be immediately condemned as having consorted with the devil. So this was a critical checkbox.
Once those 2 hurdles were cleared, the Dauphin was reassured enough to fully equip her.
He commissioned a full suit of plate armor for her, a massive expense. She designed her own banner and famously requested a specific ancient sword that was said to be buried under the altar at a church.
Saint Catherine de Fierbois.
That's the one, and the psychological shift she represented, you just can't overstate it.
Before she arrived, the Armagnacs were a broken, despairing force. They'd been at war for nearly a century.
And even if the strategic situation wasn't completely hopeless, the English were arguing among themselves, the Burgundians were wavering, the French morale was just gone.
And Joan changed all of that.
Completely. Her absolute, unwavering conviction transformed what had been a technical diplomatic squabble over inheritance into a righteous religious war for the salvation of France. She gave the soldiers a reason to fight that was bigger than their loyalty to a disputed dauphin.
You see that change immediately. Before she even gets to Orléans, she dictates this ferocious letter to the Duke of Bedford, the English commander.
It's not a diplomatic note. It's a divine ultimatum. She warns him that she was sent by God to expel them and demands they leave immediately.
So the campaign finally begins with the siege of Orléans. She arrives with a relief army on April 29th, 1429, and the city, which was starved and exhausted, just greets her with massive enthusiasm.
But, despite her eventual fame, at first she was treated as a morale-boosting figurehead, not a commanding officer.
Right. She wasn't included in the military councils. She wasn't given formal command.
A fact she later testified to. But she became a force multiplier. She used her banner, her symbol of divine authority, and just her sheer presence on the front lines to inspire the troops.
And that inspiration quickly turned into real influence. Commanders saw the effect she had, how ready the troops were to charge when she was there, and they started taking her tactical advice.
You see it play out immediately at the Bastille de Saint-Loup on May 4th. The Armagnacs had attacked and were actually retreating after a failure. Joan shows up, and her appearance alone rallies them.
They turn around and launch a second assault.
Driven by this new divine fervor, and they take the fortress.
The next day, May 5th, was Ascension Thursday, a holy day.
And she respected that. No combat. Instead, she dictates another warning letter to the English, famously ties it to a crossbow bolt, and has it fired into their lines.
The main push came on May 6th.
Right. They took a position the English had abandoned, Saint-Jean-de-Blanc. The commanders, always cautious, wanted to consolidate, but Joan pressed them to attack Les Augustins.
A fortress built around a monastery.
And they captured it. And again, the commanders hesitated. They wanted to pause, consolidate their gains. And again, Joan pushed them to ignore caution and keep going toward the main English stronghold, Les Tourelles.
The decisive action was May 7th. She was right in the thick of it, holding her banner.
When she was seriously wounded, an arrow struck her between the neck and the shoulder.
An injury like that would have sidelined most people for weeks.
But she returned later that same day, wounded but defiant. And she encouraged the final successful assault that overwhelmed and captured Les Tourelles.
The result was just immediate and spectacular. The English commanders, seeing the defeat and the total collapse of their men's morale, just retreated from Orléans the next day, May 8th. The siege was over.
And this is the moment where the political and theological significance just crystallizes. Remember that test at Poitiers?
They said success would be the sign.
And the lifting of the siege was instantly interpreted by the French clergy, including prominent figures like Archbishop Jacques Gelou and the theologian Jean Gerson, as the unambiguous sign that proved her divine origin.
And on the other side, for the English.
For the English and their Burgundian allies, the fact that a peasant girl could so rapidly defeat their professional armies was equally and immediately interpreted as definitive proof of demonic possession.
The stakes were no longer just military.
They were cosmic.
Joan, capitalizing on this huge momentum, insisted on a swift advance to Reims for Charles's coronation.
Charles agreed, and the Loire campaign was designed to clear that path. She accompanied the army under the command of John II, Duke of Alençon.
And Alençon was a key ally for her.
He was. Unlike some of the other cautious nobles, he really respected her counsel and collaborated with her, which strengthened her ability to act on the battlefield.
So in June 1429, the objective was to clear the bridge towns along the Loire, Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency.
At Jargeau, on June 11th, Joan advocated for a direct assault, and they captured it the next day. And again, she showed incredible personal bravery. She was actually struck by a stone that split her helmet while she was scaling a siege ladder.
Just incredible tenacity. And it's worth noting, in that Jargeau capture, many of the English who surrendered were killed. This was brutal medieval warfare.
It was. The army moved fast. June 15th, they took the bridge at Meung-sur-Loire, and by June 18th, the English garrison at Burgundian just surrendered.
Which was a bit premature on their part.
Very. The English commander had no idea that a major relief army under Sir John Fastolf was approaching from Paris.
So when the Armagnacs learned that Fastolf's army was retreating, Joan urged an immediate aggressive pursuit.
And the two armies met that afternoon, June 18th, at the Battle of Patay.
Fastolf had prepared an ambush with hidden archers.
But the Armagnac vanguard detected them and scattered them before they could even get set up. The whole thing was less a battle and more a rout. The English army was decimated.
And Joan wasn't in that initial charge, but her insistence on the rapid pursuit was credited by everyone with making that crushing victory possible. The string of wins was just unprecedented.
The path was now open. The march to Reims began on June 29th. The Armagnac army advanced virtually unopposed.
Towns that had resisted Charles for years, like Auxerre, they just switched their allegiance. Troyes held out for 4 days, but Joan just ordered an assault preparation, and the town immediately surrendered.
It's a perfect illustration of the power of her reputation by that point. The sight of her and her army was enough to break the will of defenders.
And then, the ultimate political validation. Reims, the traditional city of consecration, opens its gates on July 16th.
Charles VII's consecration took place the very next morning. Joan was given a position of immense honor, proclaiming that God's will had been fulfilled. This ceremony didn't just celebrate victory, it cemented Charles's contested claim, legitimizing him in the eyes of France and God.
But the euphoria of Reims faded very quickly. With Charles now crowned, the cautious, traditional political establishment went right back to its old habits.
Calculation, diplomacy. And this spelled trouble for Joan's aggressive, divinely mandated style of warfare.
Right. The court immediately prioritized political negotiation. Charles entered into a 15-day truce with the Duke of Burgundy,
who promised to transfer Paris to Charles, but it was just a political feint. He reneged on the promise entirely.
And this political drift caused immense frustration for Joan and her ally, the Duke of Alençon.
They argued vehemently for a rapid march on Paris to capitalize on their momentum. Instead, the court's slow advance, bogged down by fruitless negotiations, just wasted valuable strategic time.
They finally launched the assault on Paris on September 8th, and it was a catastrophic failure.
The Armagnacs suffered 1,500 casualties. Joan herself was struck in the leg by a crossbow bolt and had to be rescued from the trench beneath the city walls after nightfall.
The consequences for her influence were swift and devastating.
The very next morning, Charles VII ordered an immediate halt to the attack, had a key bridge dismantled, and forced a retreat. Joan was profoundly displeased, arguing fiercely for the attack to continue.
And that failure at Paris was the turning point for the court's faith in her. Her aggressive strategy no longer aligned with Charles's preference for a negotiated peace.
And the scholars at the pro-English University of Paris immediately seized on the failure, arguing publicly that her inability to take the capital proved her inspiration was not divine. The sign of Orléans was suddenly being questioned.
So Charles responded by actively minimizing her role. He disbanded the army that had marched to Reims.
And critically, he prevented her from working with her trusted military ally, Alençon, ever again. She was deliberately sidelined.
She was sent on a smaller campaign against a brigand captain. She did manage a success at the siege of Saint-Pierre-le-Moutier in November.
But her reputation took another hit right after that. The siege of La Charité-sur-Loire failed. They were forced to abandon their heavy artillery in the retreat, which was a huge material loss and a blow to her military credibility.
Despite these diminishing returns, Charles did reward her family. In December 1429, he ennobled Joan and her family for their service.
Which shows that while he might have been sidelining her militarily, he still recognized her immense political and symbolic value.
But during the extended truce with the Burgundians, which lasted until Easter of 1430, the royal court just had no use for her.
Her whole purpose, driving military success, was suspended in favor of diplomacy.
But the truce was fragile. The Duke of Burgundy began reclaiming towns, including the vital town of Compiègne.
And Joan, driven by her mission, organized an expedition of volunteers at the end of March 1430 to relieve the siege.
This was basically an unauthorized military action.
Essentially, yes. She proceeded without Charles's explicit documented permission, though it's highly probable she had some financial backing from the court. It suggests Charles sort of tolerated it to keep pressure on the Burgundians without officially breaking the truce himself.
Her final military success was at Lagny-sur-Marne, where her troops defeated a mercenary captain named Francois d'Arras.
And typically, a commander like that would have been ransomed for a huge sum. But Joan insisted on putting him on trial and allowed the townspeople to execute him.
Which, while popular with the locals, showed a disregard for the established rules of warfare that many nobles relied upon.
And then the end came, brutally. On May 23rd, 1430, during a desperate failed sally from Compiègne against the Burgundian camp, Joan was pulled from her horse and captured.
For the English and Burgundians, this was a massive propaganda victory. They didn't just capture a military leader.
They captured the symbol of French divine providence, and they moved her between several castles while they negotiated her fate.
The pressure on the Burgundians to hand her over to the English was immense.
Driven largely by Bishop Pierre Cauchon of Beauvais, a fervent pro-Burgundian partisan who saw a clear path to political advancement by prosecuting her.
The negotiations concluded in November. The English paid a massive 10,000 livres tournois for her ransom.
And to put that into perspective for you, that was an astronomical amount, the equivalent of ransoming a major noble. It shows the English crown's absolute commitment to getting their hands on her, not for military purposes, but for a trial.
And this is the fact that continues to haunt French history. Once she was transferred to English custody, there was no documented evidence that Charles VII made any official attempt to save her.
None.
So why? Was it just the cost? Was it that he'd already sidelined her and she was now a political liability?
It was likely a cruel convergence of all of those things. The ransom was high, and the political cost of trying to retrieve a potentially compromised asset, one whose divine mandate was now openly questioned, was simply too great. By letting the English have her, Charles could distance himself from the controversy.
The military savior had become the political liability.
Exactly. And we have to mention her sheer desperation during captivity. She made 2 escape attempts. One involved a dramatic jump from a tower into a dry moat, which injured her.
It just shows her absolute refusal to accept her fate passively.
The trial began in Rouen on January 9th, 1431. And it was a masterful piece of political theater. It was strategically disguised as a purely ecclesiastical inquiry into heresy.
Which allowed them to bypass the laws around treating her as a prisoner of war.
Right, and the objective was crystal clear and purely political: destroy Charles VII's legitimacy. If Joan, the woman who led him to his coronation, could be proven a heretic acting under demonic influence,
then Charles was consecrated by an agent of the devil. His claim to the throne would be invalid, and the English claim for Henry VI would be strengthened.
The outcome was predetermined by the structure of the court. The presiding judge was Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a French partisan loyal to the Burgundians and heavily subsidized by the English crown.
And the composition of the court cemented that bias. Of the 131 clergy who participated, nearly all were French.
Which sounds fair on the surface. But they were overwhelmingly pro-Burgundian and pro-English, with many scholars from the University of Paris, which was the intellectual stronghold supporting the Anglo-French monarchy.
The entire process was just rife with irregularities, directly violating canon law.
For one, Joan should have been held by the church in an ecclesiastical prison and guarded by women. Instead, she was deliberately kept in chains by English male guards, which guaranteed her mistreatment.
And second, Cauchon failed to establish her infamy beforehand, which was a prerequisite in canon law for charging someone as a heretic.
He just skipped the step. Furthermore, she was denied legal counsel, which was essential given the complexity of the theological traps they were laying for her. The charges weren't even read until well into the interrogations.
And later investigations showed strong evidence that the trial records themselves were falsified.
The illegitimacy of it was even recognized internally. One cleric stepped down because he believed the testimony was coerced. Another who challenged Cauchon was jailed for it.
But despite all of that pressure, Joan showed remarkable control during the interrogations.
She really did. She managed to force her inquisitors to ask questions sequentially, and often just demanded that sessions end when she felt they were becoming too abusive.
And this brings us to that famous theological trap question,
Ah, yes. She was asked if she knew she was in God's grace.
which was designed to be an immediate confession of heresy. If she said yes, she committed the heresy of presumption. If she said no, she confessed her own guilt.
And her response was just stunning in its prudence. She said, "If I was not in God's grace, I hoped God would put me there. And if I was in God's grace, then I hoped I would remain so."
It completely evaded the trap and revealed a theological subtlety that just shocked her highly educated interrogators.
They even considered using torture to break her resolve, but the assessors rejected it by majority vote after she refused to be intimidated.
The political machine just kept churning. In early May 1431, the heresy charges were officially approved by the University of Paris. And on May 24th, at the churchyard of Saint Ouen, she performed her act of abjuration.
She publicly agreed to submit to the church's authority. She signed a document agreeing not to bear arms or wear men's clothes again.
And there's another irregularity here. The document she actually signed might have been only 8 lines long, but the official trial record later replaced it with a much longer, more damning text.
Right, so after the abjuration, she was legally considered a penitent. She switched to a woman's dress, her head was shaved, and the crucial part of the agreement was that she would be transferred to an ecclesiastical prison with female guards.
But the English immediately violated that.
They sent her right back to her original cell in chains under the custody of the English male guards. Witnesses at the later rehabilitation trial testified to the mistreatment and alleged sexual assault attempts she endured.
Witnesses also suggested that the guards intentionally put the male garments back in her cell, effectively forcing her hand.
And when Cauchon visited her cell on May 28th, Joan explained her decision to resume wearing them. She cited 2 practical reasons: the necessity of male dress for protection, and the fact the judges had broken their promises to move her and let her attend Mass.
But the decision to wear the clothes was the smallest part of it. The truly damning statement came when Cauchon asked about her voices.
And she stated clearly that the voices had rebuked her for abjuring out of fear and that she would not deny them again.
And that refusal to deny her voices was the point of no return.
It was. Since her abjuration required her to deny her personal revelations, her return to affirming them was sufficient evidence to convict her as a relapsed heretic. And once she was a relapsed heretic, the church's hands were canonically clean, and the state could execute her.
2 days later, on May 30th, 1431, at about 19 years old, Joan of Arc was led to her execution.
In a final, strange act of minor clemency, she was allowed to receive the sacraments that morning, which was highly unusual.
She was taken to Rouen's old marketplace, and legally, she should have been transferred to a secular official for sentencing.
But instead, she was delivered directly to the English authorities, ensuring the execution remained firmly under their political control.
She was tied to a tall, plastered pillar for burning. In her final moments, she asked to see a cross.
An English soldier, perhaps moved, fashioned a simple cross from a stick. A processional crucifix was also brought and held before her eyes as the execution began.
And to prevent any relics from being gathered, her body was completely burned and her remains were thrown into the Seine River.
The English hoped her execution would crush the French resistance.
But ironically, it didn't. Her triumphs had provided this irreversible spiritual boost to the Armagnacs. The momentum continued, and by 1453, the English were expelled from all of France except Calais.
But the heresy verdict was still a huge political problem for Charles VII. If the woman who led him to his coronation was officially a heretic, his entire claim to the throne was tainted.
So he needed that judgment legally overturned.
And the process began relatively quickly. In 1450, Charles ordered the first inquest. It concluded that the original judgment was arbitrary.
A second, more intense inquest followed in 1452, led by Cardinal Guillaume de Stouteville and the Inquisitor of France, Jean Bréal. They interviewed about 20 original witnesses.
And they found conclusive evidence of systemic bias and procedural fraud.
The political climate was finally right. After the English were expelled, the path was clear. Pope Calixtus III granted permission for a full rehabilitation trial, which began in November 1455 at Notre Dame.
It was a very public event. Joan's elderly mother, Isabelle Romée, publicly requested her daughter's rehabilitation, turning it into a public act of restitution. The trial concluded on July 7, 1456.
And the verdict was conclusive. The original 1431 trial was declared unjust, fraudulent, and deceitful. Her abjuration and execution were formally nullified.
And in a powerful symbolic gesture, a copy of the original Articles of Accusation was publicly torn up, and a cross was ordered to be erected on the very site of her execution in Orléans.
One of the most complex parts of her life, and the one her condemnation hinged on, was her clothing.
The male garments and short hair were explicitly singled out as the emblem of her heresy.
The legal argument was that cross-dressing was a defiance of God's order. But Joan's rationale was entirely practical and spiritual.
Right. She claimed divine command that the dress was necessary for her mission as a warrior. And she also cited the practicality of armor and, crucially, using men's clothes for protection against rape.
Which is why she immediately put them back on when she was returned to the cell with male guards.
And the theology on this wasn't even black and white. Thomas Aquinas had permitted cross-dressing when necessary to hide from enemies. Jean Gerson, a prominent French theologian, had publicly deemed her male clothes appropriate for a warrior.
So scholars today argue her clothing wasn't about deception, but transcendence. It helped her cement her unique identity as La Pucelle.
It allowed her to operate in a man's world without conforming to traditional female expectations, serving as a powerful sign of her unique status that transcended conventional gender roles.
And her legacy as a national symbol began almost immediately. The city of Orléans began its annual celebration of the lifting of the siege in 1429, a celebration that continues to this day.
For centuries, her legacy was tied strictly to the divine right of the monarchy, which meant during the French Revolution, her reputation was questioned because of those monarchical links.
But her power as a symbol of French independence was just too great to ignore. Napoleon authorized the renewal of the festival in 1803.
He said she proved that there is no miracle which French genius cannot accomplish when national independence is threatened. She officially became the defender of the nation, separate from the monarchy.
And that's the enduring power of her myth, right? She's been a rallying point across the entire political spectrum.
Absolutely. After the Franco-Prussian War, she was the symbol of reclaiming Lorraine. During World War II, Vichy France, the Free French, even the communist resistance all invoked her image. She remains a crucial political reference point today.
Her status in the church also advanced. Beatified in 1909, canonized in 1920.
And in 1922, Pope Pius XI declared her a patron saint of France.
But let's get into that theological nuance. She was canonized as a virgin, not a Christian martyr. Why the distinction? She was burned at the stake.
It's a complex but crucial point. She was executed by a court that, despite its massive bias, was considered canonically constituted. They didn't execute her for denying the core tenets of Christianity, the divinity of Christ, for example.
They executed her for private revelation.
Exactly, for her personal, direct communication from God, her voices, which she refused to deny. In the court's eyes, denying her voices was disobedience to their judgment, not denial of universal church dogma. She died for obeying what she personally believed was God's direct command.
Nevertheless, she's been popularly revered as a martyr ever since.
For her purity, her convictions, and her country.
And finally, let's return to the source of it all. The mystery of the visions. Theologians of her era believed supernatural visions are possible. The trial assessors just sought to prove them demonic.
And the rehabilitation trial was legally cautious. It nullified the sentence, but never actually declared the visions authentic. It wasn't until 1894 that Pope Leo XIII pronounced her mission as divinely inspired.
And in the modern era, speculation has tried to rationalize the experience. Diagnoses from epilepsy and ergot poisoning to schizophrenia have been suggested.
But the critique of those modern diagnoses is strong. Scholars argue that the primary source material, the trial records, were highly biased documents specifically created to prove her guilty of heresy. They are, poor, unreliable sources for an objective medical diagnosis.
Regardless of the medical truth, we know the impact was profound. Her absolute belief in her voices gave her extraordinary confidence, self-trust, and the inner strength that sustained her through her captivity and trial. So what does this all mean for you, the learner? We've traced Joan of Arc's life, how a deeply religious peasant girl, propelled by divine certainty, became a military savior, only to be rejected by the very king she crowned and destroyed by a hostile political legal machine. Her entire legacy rests on the knife edge of her unwavering personal conviction.
And the paradox of her identity is what defines her enduring power. She gained legitimacy through her virginity, a symbol of traditional female virtue, yet she was condemned and later celebrated for explicitly transcending gender roles through her men's clothing and her command of men in battle.
This leaves us with a final provocative thought, something for you to mull over. Joan insisted her male clothing was purely practical, a necessity for war and protection from assault. But when does a simple necessity for function, like wearing armor in battle, become an intentional revolutionary act of identity? When did Joan's utility transform into her ultimate defiant challenge to the established male-dominated order? Think about how those garments, far from hiding her, actually became the signature of her unique and profound authority.
A truly enduring question for an absolutely singular life. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the history and legacy of Joan of Arc.
We'll catch you next time.